Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick, and with me, as always, is Evan. Good day to you, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, so we are back to Genesis 3:15. Let's take a look at that real quick. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and her offspring. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. All right, so we're going to take a look at this verse and consider a meaning that is a little bit different than what you probably heard in church, if you ever heard this verse preached about. Oftentimes, people like to see this verse as the kind of first description of the gospel message, right? As something that foreshadows Jesus, something they would call a proto-evangelium. I understand why some people, looking backwards from the gospel perspective, might see that in here. But this is what we talked about in some of our first episodes, the idea of not just reading backwards, reading forwards. And I think if you look from the author's perspective here, I certainly don't see that, the promise of that in this. And there's a few different reasons why they actually seem to contradict the idea of this being a kind of reference to Jesus. So we're going to look at this bit by bit, this verse, and see that while there's something here that relates to the gospel message, I don't think to say this, really encompasses the idea of Jesus makes all that much sense. So the first thing that we see here that I think is interesting is the enmity is between the it's not between the serpent the enmity we see here is between the serpent and the woman, right? It's not a conflict of all humanity. It's actually just addressing the woman specifically in terms of this enmity. That is interesting because that would seem to work against the idea of it pointing to Jesus. But in our perspective here that we've talked about, this would be specifically the idea of enmity between the serpent and the feminine instinct, right? And you can go back to the episodes of where the temptation occurs for an explanation of why that might be.
Yeah, and it seems like the spirit of both. And so maybe the I guess we didn't get into this very much, but the spirit of what the serpent is.
Yes.
What the serpent represents.
Yeah.
This deceptive evil nature. Again, we did get into saying that it's not explicit that the serpent is Satan, but it certainly seems to be some he has similar qualities. He plays out that same pattern. Yes. And so this pattern of serpent and this pattern of femininity are going to have enmity between the two.
Yes.
Yeah, that's different. That's more. That's well, I don't want to say it's more profound, but it's different than just saying the woman is all of humanity.
Right.
No, that's the things that come out of the feminine that he's referencing, the offspring of the feminine. Yeah. Okay.
And it specifically references enmity between their offspring or seed, is what that word is often actually translated as, not actually offspring so much. The bruising, right, that is described here occurs between their seeds. And while it might seem like Jesus is, the eventual seed of the woman, Jesus does more than bruise the offspring of the serpent. He defeats the serpent, right? He defeats the Satan, the ultimate archetype of this serpent pattern, right? The fullest version of that pattern. So that what's described here sounds weak in terms of what Jesus actually does. It doesn't sound like the fullness of what Jesus does. It sounds like a much more diminished version of that, and one that is not so final, right, as what Jesus accomplishes. So that's one thing that causes me to sort of look at that with a little bit of skepticism. Another element is the ordering of the verse, right? It seems to me that if this was truly meant to describe Jesus's final victory, the bruising of the serpent's head would be the concluding phrase, but it's not. Instead, after the head is crushed, he still manages to bite the heel, presumably the heel that, stomped the head, that bruised the head. That doesn't sound like Jesus's defeat of Satan to me, right? I read a few different places where they describe here, and this is interesting, that the verb for this bruising, it's in the imperfect form. And that implies a kind of repetition to it, not a sense of finality, that there's this bruising is not the last word in this conflict.
Well, we don't have the imperfect, I think, in English. Maybe we do. I don't believe we do. I only know that in the foreign languages I've studied, we have imperfects. I don't know if we're
imperfects.
Yeah, imperfects versus preterettes. I know that in Spanish they have it, and imperfect versus a preterite is actually a very hard thing for English speakers to get their head around,
because we don't really have
it's the same word, but it has different meanings depending on the form that you put it in.
Right.
And so imperfect preterite tends to refer to things that are completed a single time. It's an event that took place. But if you say something like, every day I go to the grocery store, that verb would be in the imperfect, or I went to the grocery store, I guess, and the languages I'm familiar with. But that's significant, because that does mean that there's not a singular event typically. That
right.
There's not that preterite typically is the singular event thing, and imperfect would mean that this is something that happens often. And I mean, I'm trying not to get ahead, because actually I don't know where you're going with this, but that would make me tend to think that, well, it's also obvious that the feminine, or the woman, doesn't have single offspring. I mean, she ultimately has many offspring.
Right.
And so it seems to be posing, rather than a final decisive victory, more so an eternal battle.
Yes. Yeah. We're sort of going to get there with it, right? Because, if this isn't a representation of the gospel, holy and Jesus coming, it does beg the question, what is this, right? And for me, I think this verse describes sort of the fundamental fundamental battle between humanity and the temptation to sin, right? Because the serpent represents temptation. It's not the same as the sin of Adam, which was kind of a sin of ignorance, right? Or disconnectedness. This is about temptation towards sin, kind of being sucked in by sin, being drawn in by sin. And so to me, the most interesting element of this verse is the shift described in the conflict with the serpent, right? Where we go from, there's conflict between, the woman and the serpent, but then really that conflict takes hold with the seed of both. And I think I actually prefer seed. I think that might be a better way to think of this, and some of the early translations do say seed. Offspring is a much more recent way of translating this term. More recent translations have done that, and perhaps that's maybe influenced by the desire to see this as foreshadowing Jesus, right? Maybe that's part of why people have done that.
Well, that's again an instance where you see we talked about this a long time ago, but there's we're trying not to get overly into translations, or because we don't have Hebrew degrees and we don't speak or read ancient Hebrew. I guess you would read it more than you speak it.
Right.
But there is an effect of what the theological conversations. There's an effect of the theological conversations on the translations.
Yes.
And so it's especially if you're approaching this without intimate understanding of ancient Hebrew, it becomes difficult to know why someone might be making the particular translation choice that they're making.
Right.
So
that's why I think there's benefit.
This would be a good example of that.
Debate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And even if we don't have maybe a stake particularly in it, it does end up, at least it's important to know that that might be informing how somebody's translating this. And if there's another potential, well, that means there could be a whole potential different interpretation.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
So if we think about this, I think the imagery of the conflict between each party's seed is a powerful one, right? A seed, a seed is symbolically really meaningful, right? It's an important idea because it describes not the final version of a thing, but like the full array of potential of what a thing might be. Okay. So for instance, if you consider the seed of an oak tree, the shape and form that oak tree takes, well, that's going to be based on the context into which it emerges, right? The levels of sun, rain, proximity with other plants, all of these things are going to have an effect on how that oak tree ends up looking. But the seed contains the sort of the full potentiality of every possible form that an oak might take. If that makes sense. So
that's the biggest thing is it represents potential rather than actuality. That's the difference. Offspring represents
a full array of potential. It's not specific, right? Offspring is specific, or is more specific, I suppose, than this idea of seed.
Yeah, it's comparable to what we look at when we look at a child or a young adult. Actually, is we probably more often look at them look at young adults more like this, or especially like teenagers, and you see potential, you see possibility, and that's seeds right there, and offspring. But once they've reached adulthood, you don't really look at them as seeds. You look at them as accessing that potential and then having fulfilled part of that.
I think
but they could still be considered
the younger
they
you
have
go,
potential,
the more they look like seeds. I mean,
I think colloquially we tend to.
Yeah, but even to the point where when the child is in the mother's womb, you get a picture, in your head of this child, but it's sort of it's full of all kinds of different potential, right? And so as a thing matures, it locks into a particular pattern. But the further it is from maturation, the more the full array of patterns are sort of available to it. So by describing this enmity as being between the seeds of the two parties, it's kind of a way of saying that no matter what form the serpent takes or what form the offspring of the woman takes, the conflict will always be there. So this emphasizes the idea of it being a perpetual conflict because it can arise in all of these different forms, right? Also, there's something to that imperfect idea that there's something cyclical in that, right? So it's like it can appear in all these different forms. And like you were saying, a woman doesn't have just one kid, and seed here doesn't describe necessarily just one offspring or one child, right? One next version. It describes successive versions of this. And so the conflict will be cyclical in nature and ongoing. And this is that sort of, I mean, it's not eternal because Jesus comes in and stops it, but it describes kind of an eternal like conflict between these two aspects. So while I don't see the verses necessarily foreshadowing like the conquest of Jesus over Satan, I think the point of this verse more is that it presents the necessity of Jesus. I think what we really see presented is in this relationship. It's humanity's struggle against sin, and we're presented with a description of not a single decisive battle like we talked about before, but this cyclical series of temptations and giving into those temptations, but then also beating those temptations down, right? The crushing the head, the biting the heel. These are, each side is having a victory here or there. And this is the perpetual struggle of humanity, right? And so what this verse describes is sort of it's not a futility, but it's like you're not going to get out of this cycle. Ultimately, Jesus will be the one that gets us out of the cycle. He's the thing that can put an end to this cycle. But I think this verse is not describing that so much as describing the cycle that causes or one of the things that causes the need for Jesus. So it's not the fullness of the gospel message, but it kind of prepares the way for it, right? Part of the problem with looking back and always seeing, well, this really is the gospel message, or this is the gospel message. And if you see everything as a kind of proto-evangelium, you get to the gospel message and it doesn't like mean anything. Like some things are just meant to create a sense of how dire the need is for the Savior, right? You have to create an understanding of what one would need to be saved from. What is the thing humanity needs a salvation and a savior from? And so a verse like this, rather than saying, oh, well, this actually describes the ultimate salvation. It's like, well, if you keep doing that with every single verse, especially when really maybe it does not warrant it, which I would argue with this verse, it doesn't. You get to the point where it's like, yeah, but it's saved from what? What is the thing we're saving from, right? And I think this actually makes, if we understand it perhaps in this way, which I think may be a better interpretation, it actually greatens the magnitude of what Christ then fulfills in the end.
Yeah, it broadens it. It broadens out the applicability of this story to say that, look, this isn't just this. Yeah, what we've been doing as we've gone through these episodes, especially with this story, is really breaking out of the historical mindset around us, and broadening out the applicability of it, and saying, look, if this represents feminine and this represents masculine, and the serpent represents deception, not necessarily a character whose name is Satan, but just broadly that pattern. This curse then is, it fits that this curse would be broadened out too, to say, look, this is a statement of how reality is going to keep presenting itself to humanity, and in this context, to the feminine, which is funny because we read the rest of the curse more along those lines. And we'll get to that part, but we read the curse to the man.
Well, it's not even a curse, right? Saying, this is a curse. This is described as a curse, right? To the serpent. Yeah. But when you get to the woman here, as we will in the next verse, it's not described as a curse.
Yeah, it's not.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you could argue that maybe this is the woman's looped in on this, obviously. Yeah. But this is to the serpent, right? It is who this is said to, and this is a curse. The only other curse is actually the ground. When we get to Adam, and we'll talk about that then. But this here is a curse to the serpent, and then it's something less than a curse when God talks to the woman. Yeah. But this is. Like we do take
those things as not singular events. Those things are descriptions of how reality is going to continue going forward. Right. But for some reason, we think this references a specific event, whereas everything else references reality. And so it doesn't seem like it's a far stretch to say, well, maybe this does just reference an
and it's the same term. Continued. Bruising the head and bruising the heel are the same term here, right? And so I mean, if you want to say, oh, well, it's still finality because one is the head versus the heel. It's like, okay, well, maybe, but you could have used different terms there, and that would have made that clearer too. And then why is the biting of the heel come second? It still doesn't explain that. So there's something to this verse that I think describes, an ongoing state of affairs. If that makes sense. So and in that way, I guess has more applicability to all of us in our day-to-day, to realize we all face this kind of challenge from the serpent, even though it's a curse upon the serpent, right? And so if you're inhabiting that pattern, this is the challenge you can expect. It's still also something valuable for those of us not wanting to inhabit the pattern of the serpent. This struggle still goes on.
Mhm.
If that makes sense. So, all right. Well, with that, we're going to wrap up. Next time we'll get to the what God says to the woman in starting in Genesis 3:16. So in the meantime, write us at unschooledtheology@protonmail.com. Leave a review, comment, rate, whatever the platform you're consuming this on, the equivalent things,
Whatever they allow you to do.
Yeah, whatever they allow you to do there. So and share it with friends or family or enemies, actually, as well. Be sure to share it with enemies
or frenemies, whatever you want to do.
Yes, if you walk that weird middle ground.
If you are a 16-year-old girl,
yes,
by all means, share it with
the only people who have frenemies. But yeah. All right, so with that, we'll see you again next time. Thanks.